Gobble, gobble, gobble! Hello, Thanksgiving buddies! Welcome to a special Thanksgiving episode of Some More News, or as we like to call it, Some Corn News! That sounded better in my head. What about crumb, poor, blueberry pie? Ooh, maybe. Blueberry pie isn't really a Thanksgiving thing. The pun needs to tie more into the theme of the episode. Crumb, poor, shoes with buckles on them like the Pilgrims wore. Perfect. I'm your news feast master, joined in the Thanksgiving tradition of fellowship by my news sock and my news boss.
I'm the boss?
Okay, you better watch that word hole, sock puppet. Hi, Cody. Thanks for shooting this episode instead of spending Thanksgiving with your family.
Yeah, well, you threatened me, so you're welcome. Anyway, how are you guys enjoying the holiday?
Oh, we Wombos love Thanksgiving, Mr. Cody. Every Wombo brings a dish. I brought spiders.
Wait, there are more of you?
Oh, we're everywhere. Silly goat?
Okay, so are you all named Warmbo, or is that your species, or like...
That's right.
What's right? Which is it? Where did you come from? How strong are your numbers?
Uh-huh. We Wombos love a day to come together to celebrate the destruction of our enemies and feast upon the sorrow of the conquered. What about your Thanksgiving?
It's kind of not that different, actually.
Yay!
Yeah. Yay. You see, Warmbo, every American knows the story of the first Thanksgiving because we were all taught it in school. We learned that the plucky pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock and quickly got themselves in some deep-ass shit. Just the deepest, filthiest shit imaginable. Imagine the deepest shit you can, and then double that. They didn't have enough food to last them through the first punishing winter, so half of those buckle-shoed church farts got a box of untimely death for Christmas, or whatever they used for boxes back in Pilgrim days. Really big hats, probably. Anyway, in the face of extreme death, the Pilgrims finally relented and let the Indians, and I'm just quoting the books there, show them how to fish and plant corn. In the name of unity and fellowship, the Pilgrims broke bread with the noble savages, again just quoting our extremely racist books, in a grand feast that lasted several days, a harvest celebration commemorating their first winter in the New World. After which, the Native Americans walked out of American history like Gandalf, heading to the Undying Lands, never to be heard from again.
That sounds nice.
Yeah, super not. Mainly because it's very much untrue. I feel like this won't come as a surprise to most, but the story of the first Thanksgiving is a tad exaggerated, and it contributes to a whitewashed narrative of American history that we've been pushing in this country since day one. It sweeps all the unpleasant truths about this nation under the rug in favor of an impossible backstory in which America is just waterlogged with intrinsic virtue. Virtue-logged. Flogged, if you will, and you will because I did. As if America was fired out of God's ass to be the greatest society in the history of the world and has never and will never do anything wrong. And we've been regurgitating it to generations of children in school, a place where kids are sent to learn facts. We've written America into the history books as a Mary Sue character, the shorthand term nerds give to characters who are written to be all-powerful and infallible. It's the kind of thing we hate sometimes and love other times for reasons that are deafeningly obvious, yet rarely admitted to. Is someone at the door?
Oh, sorry, that's me. Didn't want you to go hungry on Thanksgiving, so I sent you a battery casserole.
A what?
Look, man, we get great engagement anytime you debase yourself, so just take a couple bites.
I don't want to. Did you say batteries? Like literal batteries?
Just try a little bit of battery.
It's batteries! I think even a little bit would kill me.
Us Wombos love batteries.
See? The felt dipshit loves them.
Okay, hang it up.
Well,
Anywho, the Thanksgiving myth is a lie America tells itself to cover up the fact that the country's racist, dismissive treatment of indigenous people has been ingrained in all of us since the very beginning. It's literally in the Declaration of Independence, which reads, "He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions." From the literal moment of its conception, America cast its indigenous people as indiscriminate subhuman murderers put on earth by God to test the faith of white people. Thomas Jefferson wrote that. Ben Franklin did a punch-up. John Hancock couldn't fucking wait to sign it. And despite the preschool storybook version of Thanksgiving that actual adults want to defend at all costs, the relationship between the United States government and Native Americans has always been that of an invading army and the people it seeks to subjugate. From 1778 to 1871, the U.S. signed 368 treaties with various Native American tribes and broke just about every single one of them almost immediately. Meanwhile, early white feminists like Alice Fletcher saw an opportunity to use indigenous people to increase their own social standing and advance their political agenda by taking on the responsibility of civilizing Native American tribes, a process that typically entailed separating Native children from their families and sending them to boarding schools, as well as forcing Native women into subordinate roles in patriarchal European society that diminished the standing and respect they had been previously afforded within their tribes. Fletcher, in particular, put a great deal of effort into suppressing the esteem with which women were held in Native American culture, because it simply wouldn't do for people to learn that these savages enjoyed more freedom, equality, and respect than God's chosen white women. And circling back to those schools for a moment, yes, those are in fact the Catholic Church-operated, federally funded boarding schools we're now seeing pop up on the news for the discovery of mass graves. Specifically, the unmarked and mass graves of Indigenous children, not just in Canada, but right here in the US of A. We're talking about thousands of kids in just the graves we've found. These mass graves, often dug by the other students, who describe truckloads of bodies left to decay for days. Oh, and if you're confused that we have witnesses, that's because the last boarding school designed for assimilation closed in the 1990s. North America has been doing casual abuse and genocides up until the film Edward Scissorhands came out. And yes, it was a genocide, at least in the earlier history. While many of these kids died from disease, there are reports from as far back as 1907 describing extreme neglect that was leading to so many of these deaths. One specific report from a man who had visited 35 of these schools found that poor ventilation in the dorms, combined with school officials downplaying the severity of the infections, had led to a situation where nearly 70% of all their former students had died. As in, the primary way kids were graduating from these schools was via corpse trucks. I don't even have a joke here. I'm so sorry. Maybe our title monkey has one. You're not even gonna try? You coward! And that's just the disease factor. To be very clear, this was on top of reports of kids being starved, abused, and flat out dying under suspicious circumstances. These places were a fucking nightmare, and were heavily rationalized by people like Alice Fletcher, good religious types who pushed the racist mischaracterization of Native Americans as backwards, misogynistic savages that need to be made civil, white settlers who either saw indigenous people as a convenient pawn, or who simply needed a way to rationalize murdering scores of human beings and stealing their homes. This attitude has persisted for centuries. It's why we have dummies like Rick Santorum unironically claiming that America was a blank slate when the Europeans arrived, and that the country's indigenous people had no culture to speak of.
We came here and created a blank slate. We birthed a nation from nothing. I mean, there's nothing here. I mean, yes, we have Native Americans, but candidly, that there isn't much Native American culture in American culture.
He made laws for a whole country. This country. This sort of attitude, acting like we were a gift to the native inhabitants of this country, this rosy version of Thanksgiving, it's no different from the fascist dictatorships that invent hogwash histories around their leaders that we mock and ridicule and hold up as dystopian cautionary examples. And yet we do the same stupid shit, using the same morally and intellectually bankrupt excuse to justify it. The thinking seems to be, well, it would cause more harm to this country to tell kids the truth about it because we don't want them to feel bad about America, as if America is a beloved grandparent with a suspiciously locked basement door. Except it's not a grandparent, it's a country, a political entity created by a bunch of white dudes who are almost as dead as they were rich. And the harm we're actually terrified of inflicting is giving kids the tools to think critically about all the walrus shit America has pulled over the past 2.5 centuries. Do you really think it's some dastardly liberal play to want to teach kids actual things that happened? We have textbooks currently in circulation that feature an essay question asking kids to either criticize or defend the treatment of Native Americans. To clarify, that treatment consisted of European colonizers and Americans killing tens of millions of Native Americans with wars and disease, and forcing Native communities off their land and into boarding schools that erased their culture and language. There are textbooks that until very recently were widely circulated in schools throughout the country, essentially asking kids whether or not the Native Americans are just a bunch of whiners. Kind of feel like that's not a both sides type of sitch, as most both sides sitches tend to be. Maybe we should be allowed to update that line of thinking, and it shouldn't be an unthinkable act of treason to want to do that. But the opposition to altering any aspect of what children have been taught in schools for the past 100 years is so strong that the GOP successfully built a gubernatorial campaign around it. Conservatives are so absolutely terrified of teaching kids the unpleasant truth about America, a country so mired in racism that we were already 5 James Bond movies deep before interracial marriage was legal. Allow me to hit that point a little harder. Legalized interracial marriage in America is roughly the same age as Paul Rudd. Congratulations, Paul. Way to hustle that dick, my friend. So yeah, we have a problem with racism in this country, and not teaching kids about it only benefits a fairy tale ignorance designed to support an image of America as an infallible entity of divinely ordained goodness, a God-given birthright to all, but only one specific God, and one specific all.
And they're talking about the United States of America. Talking about the United States of America, because when Matthew mentioned it in the Bible, he wasn't talking about the physical ground that he was on. He was talking about something in the distance. So if we are going to have one nation under God, which we must, we have to have one religion, one nation under God and one religion under God, right?
Yeesh. Also, wowza. And maybe egads? This is all the same mentality used by defenders of Columbus Day, treating this long-dead historical figure like he's Santa Claus and Jesus combined, like if Santa wore a skin suit made of Jesus or something. Sugar in wine, right? From Men in Black, but you switched, it's not water anymore. Anyway, I don't know. Never mind that Columbus was identified as a genocidal monster while he was still alive, and his arrest was even later put on a fucking United States commemorative stamp. Interestingly enough, that stamp was issued a year after the first Columbus Day was first established as a holiday to ease diplomatic relations with Italy after 11 Italian immigrants were killed by a lynch mob in New Orleans, an action that was praised as justice by contemporary newspaper reports. And boy, it's pretty tough to imagine a lot of these right-wing grifters giving one ghost of a butt's poop about changing the name of Columbus Day if they actually knew its conception was an appeasement for immigrants. Seems like if they existed during this time, we all sort of know what they'd be tweeting about. Although, without Twitter, I guess they'd have to write it like on a horse or something and send the horse, you write it on the horse, and then you send the horse into town for everybody to read the horse that you sent. And you have to go get the horse back and then like wash it off for your next tweet. I don't know. It seems complicated. But the point is, there's nothing sacred about Columbus or Thanksgiving. It's just politics and mythology that we perpetuate to avoid acknowledging the brutally racist truth about our country's history. And yet Thanksgiving is a particularly big culture war battleground for right-wing finks, who all tend to rally around the same bad faith argument that the literal history of Thanksgiving, or the conflict that followed it, isn't as important as the lesson of tradition and morality it represents. It's about setting aside our differences and coming together as one for one day, part of one day, really just for an afternoon. Unless you're one of those weirdos who eats Thanksgiving at like 10 a.m. and it's about giving thanks, you see. And in some of their minds, thanks specifically to God.
But the sense of purpose of the original Pilgrims left a permanent imprint on the national character. They maintained unshakable confidence that God protected them, not to grant special privileges, but to impose special responsibilities. They saw themselves as instruments, not authors, of a mysterious master plan. Today, with our continued blessings so obvious and so overwhelming, the only reason to treat this beloved national holiday as a time of mourning is that some foolish Americans actually think that's a good idea. The Pilgrims knew better. They understood that people of every culture and every era can gain more from gratitude than from guilt.
Yeah, see? Be like the Pilgrims and feel gratitude and not guilt. They didn't feel any guilt. What with the fact that they existed before the series of atrocities against the Native Americans happened, bet they weren't concerned about Nazis or Facebook either. So why should we be? It's foolproof. But this idea that we either have to be blindly thankful or overwhelmingly guilty is just such a transparently false dichotomy. It assumes that being thankful or celebrating togetherness doesn't work unless you ignore negative aspects of something, when actually the opposite is true. Let's just pretend, for the sake of argument, that the fairy tale version of Thanksgiving is true, and that these chud balloons actually do care about the holiday's message of being compassionate and charitable to all people. Simply giving thanks or celebrating a day to spread goodwill is meaningless until you start changing your behavior and exploring the actual truths behind these holidays. The holiday doesn't matter if you don't practice what it represents. So what has America actually done to give thanks and spread goodwill to Native American communities? Well, we're gonna explore exactly that, but first, it's time to give thanks to these advertisements. Gratitude advertisements. Ad time.
Hey, hello, hi, how's it going? How you doing? Listen up, man. Thanksgiving can be a hectic time of the year. You got the family, you got the cleaning, the travel, and if you're a traditionalist, you might even take to the woods and hunt down your own yams. It is a lot. Over 500 Americans are killed by yams every year. But one thing you don't have to worry about is getting a good deal on your home or car insurance, and that is thanks to PolicyGenius.com, an insurance broker that will make it easy to compare home and auto insurance in one place. They've actually saved customers an average of $1,250 per year over what they were paying for home and auto insurance. And all you have to do is head over to PolicyGenius.com and answer a few quick questions about yourself and your property. They'll take it from there. We've all had our cars tipped over at least once by a horde of angry yams, or one of the millions of yam injuries people sustained across this country every holiday season. But Policy Genius will give you peace of mind and let you compare rates from America's top insurers, from Progressive to Allstate, to find your lowest quotes. If they find a better rate than what you're paying now, well, they will switch you over for free. So head on over to PolicyGenius.com and get started right now, you yam heads. Again, that is PolicyGenius.com, you yam heads.
Hey, listen, it's Cody. What are you up to right now? Drinking coffee? Maybe you just drank coffee, or are thinking about perhaps drinking some coffee. Maybe you rub it on your skin when you go to the beach. I don't think that's recommended, but perhaps you do it anyway, you coffee rebel. You amaze me. And since you love coffee so much, perhaps you should check out Trade. Trade is an online coffee delivery company that will match you to flavors you love from 400 plus craft coffees, then send you a freshly roasted bag as often as you'd like. You do the beep boops and get on their website, and they have a quiz that'll match you with the perfect cup, like a dating service for your mouth. Trade partners with 55 plus small US-based roasters who are committed to ethical and sustainable sourcing. That's good too. You freaking love coffee so much. It's wild. It's sick, bro. And for you coffee freaks, right now Trade is offering your first bag free and $5 off your bundle at checkout. To get yours, go to drinktrade.com/more news and use promo code more news. Take the quiz to start your journey to the perfect cup. That's drinktrade.com/more news, promo code more news for your first bag free and $5 off your bundle. Bathe in it, you absolute devil. Hey, gobble gobble, we're back, and we're talking about how we treat the first Thanksgiving like it's Santa's workshop. This vague and bizarre myth that kids have to gradually learn isn't real.
Santa is real. I've seen his bones.
Right, also Warmbo is here, and Katy's trying to make me eat batteries, let's not forget that.
They're not even the big ones, Cody, they're the little guys.
Okay, so we were also talking about what we could be doing to actually give thanks on this day. For starters, we can just teach the actual story of Thanksgiving. that might be a neat thing for us to do. In reality, the first Thanksgiving was more of a peace summit or a political negotiation. The Wampanoag, the native people who met with the English settlers on the first Thanksgiving in an historic moment of diplomacy and peaceful coexistence, sought out the English as potential allies against the rival Narragansett. The English didn't even take it very seriously, as evidenced by the fact that the only 2 direct historical records of the event were each about a paragraph long. It wasn't a rosy fairy tale, it was a shrewd alliance negotiated between 2 communities that were beset by famine and disease. It wasn't making the band season 1, it was making the band season 2. Little making the band ref for all you band heads. You are welcome for the making the band reference, you folks. But giving the event its proper historical context doesn't diminish the holiday's message of setting aside our differences and coming together as equals to celebrate peace and the hope of a better tomorrow. In fact, it sounds like something you should learn about in school. Is it truly so much to ask to introduce some genuine history about Native American culture alongside the turkey pine cones, turkey chalk outlines, and fundamentalist cosplay? Will it ruin Thanksgiving to teach kids the unvarnished and more nuanced truth about the holiday? Wouldn't the story of the first Thanksgiving be that much more remarkable if it was a moment of peace and fellowship in the middle of a shaky alliance that didn't last?
Are you asking me?
Oh, no, I was asking them, kind of. Do you have rhetorical questions in your weird little family?
Are you asking me?
Ooh, walked right into that one, didn't ya? Maybe it's time to stop flapping your beard and eat some batteries.
I don't want to eat the batteries.
Yeah, but you're going to.
No, listen, I'm just trying to impart a little wisdom to our son? Friend, I thought we made him like a prop, but now he says there's like more Warmbos. I don't even remember life before him, to be honest. What is he? Warmbo, what are you?
Are you asking me?
Yes, I'm asking you.
He's gonna be your pallbearer if you don't start horking acid tubes, newsboy.
Hanging up again.
Don't you hang...
Teaching kids the truth about Thanksgiving and the reality of the relationship between the English settlers and the Native Americans doesn't mean there isn't an important lesson to be taught about unity and coexistence and forming supportive relationships with your fellow human beings. In fact, many advocates pushing for a more historically accurate and inclusive version of Thanksgiving to be taught in schools don't really want to change anything about the holiday itself, because of course not. The actual day is pretty great. You take the day off from work to eat pie and argue with the elderly. The bigger grievance is the stuff we see in schools, having students give each other Indian names and make feather headdresses, which are sacred cultural practices. But advocates for changing the lesson plan around Thanksgiving have suggested alternate activities, like making Native American chokers that are more appropriate for kids. You still get to do bullshit arts and crafts. It's really not a big change. These aren't fundamental shifts, but really just come down to changing the superficial details to make very unsuperficial differences. You know, kind of like how if a sports team has a super racist name, changing that name doesn't fundamentally change sports. Yeah, let's talk about that for a second. The problem with the Braves, or the Indians, or the fucking Redskins, is that they're all reducing an entire ethnicity of people to t-shirt friendly mascots. First of all, the fact that indigenous Americans were ever referred to as Indians is emblematic of the entire issue. Although American Indian has become part of accepted terminology that includes Native American, indigenous people, and simply Native or indigenous, the term Indian was a misnomer. But it was a misnomer that America never bothered to correct, because indigenous Americans didn't matter to them. Their identity, their culture, their entire existence is incidental. A footnote in the margins of white history. They're called Indians because that's what white people decided to call them, and America as a whole has never felt compelled to correct or even acknowledge that. This country is so willfully oblivious to the cultural erasure of Native Americans that we have a professional baseball team called the Indians with a minstrel character as its mascot. Try to imagine a professional sports team doing this with literally any other race. Try to picture it, if your imagination will but allow it. A World Series showdown between the Colorado and the Chicago We're not even going to do a funny graphic for that because we'd have to immediately cancel ourselves. The point is, the very notion of professional sports teams being named after racial slurs is so grotesquely offensive, we can't even joke about it. And yet, we have been selling tickets to the Washington f***ing Redskins since 1933. And that name didn't change until the year 2020. The Redskins. That's not old-timey racism. That's contemporary to-the-minute racism. That's the breaking news of racism. We should wince every time someone says that word like we're listening to Hulk Hogan finding out his daughter is dating a black man. Good point, monkey. You've always been my rock. Given conservative media's hyperbolic reaction to anything that even calls the sacred infallibility of whiteness into question, can you imagine the uproar if the Seattle Snowflakes went to the Super Bowl? How many weeks of television would Tucker Carlson devote to sweaty, pink-faced rage rants about the Minnesota Lily Whites? Imagine how many pearls would be clutched at a local PTA meeting over a child wearing a cracker-eating honkies jersey to school. Dare your mind to conjure Ben Shapiro's twerpy meltdown over the world champion Wilmington White Devils. Can you imagine the endless stream of outraged tweets he'd smash out with his busy fingers if a professional sports team had an exaggerated racist caricature of a peach-faced European as their mascot? Oh, right. But you get where I'm coming from here. The point is, it's not respectful to name a sports team after an ethnic group of people. It's trivializing them. It's not respectful to do the tomahawk chop when your team is doing well. There's nothing respectful about launching into a racist stereotype every time your team scores a point. That is no different from a stadium full of people in blackface chanting Mammy. You're reducing an entire culture to a mascot, alongside goofy animal shit like the Chicago Bulls and the Toronto Raptors. That's dehumanizing. These team names aren't referencing a profession like the Steelers or the Oilers, or even a specific regional moniker like the Yankees. It's just the Braves, or the Indians, or the goddamn the other one. Right-wing doofuses like Ben Shapiro take to Twitter to argue that the real tragedy over changing the name of the Cleveland Indians is the disgrace we're bringing to the real-life American Indian after whom the team was named.
Supposedly, or allegedly, the Cleveland Indians were originally named after a guy named Louis Siler-Gonzales, who was of the Penobscot tribe of Maine, an actual Native American. He played for the Cleveland Spiders at the time, from 1897 to 1899. And he was so popular that they kind of changed the nickname of the team to the Indians. Has there ever been an implication that the Cleveland Indians name was chosen to mock Indians, as in Native Americans? No, but once again, it's all performative virtue signaling. And then when you notice that there's an attempt to paint everything as historically racist and necessarily changing, when you paint it that way, and then people say, well, you know, that's kind of weird and unnecessary. People are like, why are you even noticing? Why do you even care? I care because you cared enough to change it. In the same way that I cared when you changed the name of the Washington Redskins. Because if you cared enough to change it, I care enough to wonder why.
Yummy.
So Ben asks aloud if there's been any implications that the name of the Cleveland Indians was created to mock Native Americans before answering the question himself, and then freaking out about why people would wonder why he's so freaked out about this. And I don't know, maybe instead of deciding what the answer was, he could have looked it up. Had he done that, he would have learned that the story he's telling about Louis Siler-Gonzales is not at all true. I don't mean it's up for debate, but rather common knowledge among anyone actually studying the history of the team. Yes, Louis Siler-Gonzales was a real baseball player, and he was an American Indian. But the trivia that the Indians were named after him because they liked him so much is not true. It came from a book from the 1940s with no history before then. The truth comes from 1914, when team owner Charles Summers hired several sports writers to come up with a new team name. The Cleveland Indians were what they landed on, and the next day the newspapers announced the change accompanied by this extremely racist cartoon. And in fact, when one sociologist went through all the promotional material for this team, she found that Louis Siler-Gonzales was not even mentioned. Not once, until 1968, right after Native Americans began to protest the mascot. It was, by all historical accounts, a racist title meant to mock the fact that they had a Native American on their team that was later levied as a defense against accusations. Exactly like Ben Shapiro did. Congratulations, Ben, on following the proud American tradition of puppeting famous minorities to support things they would abhor. Also, the tradition of not Googling something before having an opinion on it.
The Guardians, the prison guard. Like, what are the words that pop to your mind when you hear Guardians? Like, the only good one is Batman, like Silent Guardian or Silent Protector, whatever it is. Cleveland Guardians. And again, all they're doing is they're trying to look for the homonymic relationship between Indians and Guardians there to try and get them through this. But yeah.
Hey, Ben, it's named after the Guardians of Traffic statues on Cleveland's Hope Memorial Bridge that literally leads to their stadium. But I guess you're not actually interested in that, are you? But this isn't just about Ben and his little feelings getting hurt, because America in general loves to habitually fetishize Native Americans in popular culture and pretend that we're honoring them. If they're not stereotyped sports mascots, they're wise and stoic guides, or fierce and noble warriors, or they're the bad guys. They're always one step away from being explicitly magical, unless they are explicitly magical. We made a movie called Renegades, where Lou Diamond Phillips hypnotizes a cop using Native American superpowers. And much like that film we all know and remember, they usually only exist to serve as supporting characters in a story about some white guy who shows just enough humility towards their mystical ways to make us feel good about lobbing a bunch of Oscars at his giant gleaming forehead. One of the most visible Native American characters of the past 10 years was played by Johnny Depp with a dead bird on his head. And that sucks. Just look at it sucking right before our eyes. And like, is it too much to ask that perhaps by giving thanks this year, we collectively recognize how weird and bad this is? That we have spent decades, up until the 2010s, not giving a flying about racist caricatures or brown-faced depictions when it came to this one specific group of people. That's like, so weird. And that lack of respect doesn't stop at sports teams or movies starring people in brownface. Hey, you ever hear of, oil? You know how America loves its delicious oil, right?
Are you asking me?
Okay, I keep hanging up on you guys and you keep coming right back.
Hey, Cody, where are we at with the batteries?
Maybe we should do another ad break while I sort out this weird and totally not plot-driven problem I'm having with people barging into this video, okay? BRB. And that stands for back really brief. Back really brief.
Hey, it's me, Katy. You know, being a Katy can be pretty exhausting at times. You gotta fill out the Katy paperwork every year, pay dues to the Katy Union. There's the weekly meetings and the team building seminars. It's a whole thing. And sometimes it's hard to keep up with all my Katy duties and still keep a balanced diet. There's so many vitamins you have to take, so much nutritional information to stay on top of. Luckily, there's AG1 by Athletic Greens, the category leading superfood product that brings comprehensive and convenient daily nutrition to everybody. And look, it's green. And delicious. One scoop of AG1 contains 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients, including a multivitamin, multi-mineral, probiotic, greens superfood blend, and more in one convenient daily serving. Forget taking a bunch of pills or conducting dark Katy rituals to extend your life force. Get out of here, rituals. AG1 is easy and tasty. And to make it even easier and tastier, Athletic Greens is going to give you an immune-supporting free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Not when your first purchase. It's not about when, it's about with. You visit athleticgreens.com/more news today. Again, simply visit athleticgreens.com/more news to take control of your health and give AG1 a try. Do it for me or for a Katy you know. We're everywhere.
Earbuds! Hi, Wombos! It's me, Wombo! You know, Wombo likes to listen to music, but headphones cost money. It's hard to get a job when you're a Wombo and everyone screams when they see you and then runs from Wombo and locks themselves in their cars, but Wombo is already in the car, and that's why I mountains. I put it in my piggy bank, and there's not very much in there, but luckily, Raycon wireless earbuds are both affordable and have amazing audio quality that's comparable to the premium bands, but more affordable than the other premium brands. Now Wombo can listen to the Doors while he rides his bike around the neighborhood. Here's Mr. Cody wearing them because Wombo's ears are scary to look at. They're good as gifts too, and their new everyday earbuds come with 3 new sound profiles, so you can make sure everything you listen to sounds the best. There's also 8 hours of playtime and a 32-hour battery life for all the Raycon earbuds. You could get your own, or maybe buy Wombo a pair by going to buyraycon.com/somenews today to unlock exclusive deals up to 30% off your Raycon order. This offer is available for a limited time, so don't miss it, you silly goat. That's buyraycon.com/somenews to unlock up to 30% off your Raycons. Buyraycon.com/somenews. Do it for Wombo, or Wombo will find you.
Okay, final ad break is done. Hope you ad freaks enjoyed them. So I bring up our Yum Yum oil because the land that America gave to Native American tribes, and I'm doing some pretty violent air quotes because gave is a phrase here meaning forcibly relocated and the land wasn't America's to give, has always been contingent upon whether or not there's any oil or gold there. If we find some oil there later, guess what? You're going to be given different land. Or more likely, you're going to have to live with a giant leaky pipeline dribbling the bubbling crude all over your community. It's toxic, it's a fire hazard, and it's contributing to the heat death of the planet. And oh, it's also illegal, specifically in violation of the hundreds of treaties the United States has signed and ultimately broken with Native American tribes. Because we suck, you see. Not us specifically, but the government around us. I mean, maybe you suck, I don't know you, but you understand my point. And if anyone tries to protest the government-sanctioned hellstraw in their backyard or attempt to block its construction, they'll be subjected to inhuman degradation, including violent assaults by police and draconian prison sentences, like we saw with the Standing Rock protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016. The Standing Rock Sioux opposed the pipeline because it violated Article 2 of the Laramie Treaty, which guaranteed the undisturbed use and occupation of the reservation land that the pipeline would be cutting through. But more importantly, the Standing Rock Sioux argued that the pipeline posed a major threat to their water supply and resources should a leak occur. And a leak probably will occur. And, in fact, has occurred several times. Pipeline spills happen at a rate of about 1 per day in the United States. Just from 2010 to 2016 alone, roughly 9 million gallons of crude oil had leaked from various pipelines across the country. So it's not if the pipeline spills, so much as it has spilled, like they all spill. The Dakota Access Pipeline was originally not going to come anywhere near the Standing Rock Sioux's land, crossing the Missouri River near North Dakota's state capital of Bismarck, but it was relocated to Sioux territory because people complained. And what were the grounds for their complaints? That a spill would poison their water supply. So the obvious solution was to violate a 170-year-old treaty and preemptively bulldoze archaeological sites on Sioux territory to make way for the pipeline's new path. You see, it's safer to build the pipeline through the reservation land, because who cares if a spill contaminates their soil or drinking water? We have to prioritize the safety of all the people in Bismarck, a city that is 90% white. And although the Standing Rock protests successfully resulted in a decision to stop construction and find a new route for the pipeline, that decision was reversed almost immediately by this f***ing guy. And the pipeline continues to operate to this day. Gee, that doesn't seem like it fits the morals of Thanksgiving, does it? Not really getting a sense of unity and fellowship here, are we, guys?
Are you asking me?
Nope! No, I'm not! Not at all! Sweet Christ, sweet Jesus Christ, Warmbo! Just this past month, the United States ignored the objection of both native tribes and environmental activists and greenlit the expansion of the 1,000-mile Line 3 pipeline that runs from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, into the US through North Dakota and Minnesota. The expansion of the pipeline will double its capacity to roughly 760,000 barrels of combustible liquid earth shit per day. Shit that, as I've already explained, is all but guaranteed to spill several times, statistically speaking, within its first 5 years of existence. But don't worry, because the pipeline company paid millions to local police to protect it. Presumably from the spilt oil, right? That's why they're doing that? Again, it's rhetorical. Come on, monkey, we've been over this. And while it's true that the Line 3 pipeline technically only affects some specific communities directly, in reality, it affects all of us, like lots of things do. Because pipelines carrying millions of gallons of oil across the country that drain, pollute, and otherwise deplete water supplies, along with uranium mining operations in places like Arizona and Nevada that drain massive amounts of water without any efforts at reclamation or replenishment and leave the ground riddled with carcinogens that we're still trying to clean up decades later, well, all of that is going to royally bone the entire planet. And not like the fun kind of royal bone where you blow a duke or something. I'm pretty sure that's what the royal piper does. Doesn't matter. It's already starting. Not the duke blowing, but the water stuff. Because thanks to record droughts that are a direct result of climate change, unchecked use by the agricultural and manufacturing industries, outdated dams, half-hearted to non-existent reclamation efforts, and the bottled water industry producing record amounts of pollution and plastic waste and hoarding reservoirs to package and sell a resource that is supposed to be free and accessible to everyone, the US is already running out of water. More than 2 million Americans lack access to clean drinking water, many of them Native Americans, and more than 44 million Americans are being served drinking water that violates the Safe Drinking Water Act. Meanwhile, agriculture uses 37% of the drinking water in the US and around 70% of drinking water worldwide, while manufacturing uses 15 to 18 million gallons per day in the US and around 19% of drinking water worldwide. Oh, and actually, those manufacturing statistics are probably bullshit. According to the EPA, the average first world nation uses about 55% of its drinking water in manufacturing and power, while the poorest countries use around 8%, which you'll notice is more than the US claims to use. The USGS notes that this data does not include water from municipal systems, but only surface and groundwater sources, making this number far greater. The numbers touted by the US are self-reported by the manufacturers, who are only required to provide that information if they're using a state or federal permit program. It kind of seems like America is lying about that. It kind of seems like America is playing it fast and loose with sacrificing clean water for the sake of capitalism across the board, and we're all starting to feel the effects, and yet only some of us are actually talking about that.
I'm mostly afraid for the future generations because this is going to affect them the most. I have a 2-year-old daughter at home, and I can't imagine what life is going to be like when she's in her mid-40s or 50s. I can't imagine what my great-grandchildren or anybody's future grandchildren or those not born yet will be going through when they come into this world.
You're wearing a T-shirt. Can you tell us what it says?
It says Mini Wachoni. It means water is life, water is sacred.
The primary mission of the Water is Life movement, which was born out of the Standing Rock protests, is to promote a global re-emphasis on the importance of water to every single living thing on the planet, and to provide clean drinking water to communities across the globe. Because this is happening everywhere, not just to the Standing Rock Sioux. Water is being contaminated by things like pipelines and mines and other industrial efforts designed to harvest fossil fuels from the earth and haul them away to be sold elsewhere, leaving the land destroyed and the people who live there with poisoned water. Water is Life is in direct opposition to unchecked capitalism and grotesque plundering and contamination of our water reserves in pursuit of a continuing dependence on fossil fuels. Not to mention the bizarre religion Americans have built around allowing the richest people in history to continue growing their fortunes at the literal expense of the planet and people. Like the mythological version of the first Thanksgiving, it's another tool of suppression and white supremacy, because many of the communities who lack access to clean drinking water are indigenous and minority communities, and America just can't be bothered to prioritize protecting them over protecting the profit margins of the fossil fuel industry. Yeah, it is! These pipelines routinely dump their unbelievably toxic payloads all over the place, and we just keep building them through native land and letting them contaminate the water that every single person in this country drinks. A whole bunch of our reservoirs are either on or near reservation land, so even the dopiest Nazi princes of Fox News are going to start to feel that sting the longer we refuse to acknowledge the way the government is still dehumanizing and mistreating its people. It sucks to have to frame the issue this way, but being a racist pair of clown pants is literally going to poison you to death. And no amount of protecting the Thanksgiving myth from pesky facts and reality as a vital cornerstone of American tradition is going to prevent that. You're just clenching hands with a construction paper pilgrim and driving straight over a cliff like Thelma and Louise. The actual American tradition of displacing its native population and pretending it didn't is directly contributing to its own destruction in other ways than just a poisoned water supply and a general rot of the soul. For instance, the native population of California, including the North Folk Mono and the Karuk and Yurok tribes, used to conduct regular ceremonial burns to attract game from hunting and to make way for the next cycle of new plants. The burns also kept old, dry underbrush from collecting and acting as kindling in massive, out-of-control wildfires. These controlled burns were vital for California's ecosystem, but when white settlers came blundering into California, not only did they violently relocate all the native tribes, but they also outlawed these ceremonial burns because white people are terrified of fire and ceremonies they didn't come up with or can't pretend that they came up with. So all that dry underbrush was just allowed to pile up over the years, like it still does to this day, resulting in the entire state burning out of control with a regularity that should be a national emergency. See, there's a mentality that we shouldn't focus on the past, that teaching young warmbos about all the horrible stuff America has done won't serve any constructive purpose, but to make them ashamed of their country. That the best thing for the country is to just move forward and not backward, and just forget the unpleasantness of our ancestors. But we're not moving forward by pretending these truths don't exist. You can't move forward by ignoring the past and erasing the reality of what was done to America's indigenous population. That's moving backward. And when has a policy of ignorance ever been beneficial in the long run? This isn't an ignorance is bliss situation. This is the ignorance of pretending there isn't a gremlin on the wing of your airplane and continuing your course over the Atlantic Ocean, blazing past every point of no return on the strength of sheer hubris. Erasing the history of an entire group of Americans is not only a heartbreaking injustice that continues to inflict quantifiable violence on that group, it's actively destroying the country. And anyone who argues against educating kids about the mythologization of Thanksgiving and the government's treatment of indigenous Americans is protecting the institutions of this country that only exist to maintain a white supremacist agenda. They're not worried about the harm being done by perpetuating this ignorance, and they're not really worried about kids feeling bad. They just don't want kids to question white supremacy and its role in, this nation. And they dress it up as wanting to protect the importance of American values, but those values don't amount to a hill of green bean casserole if we're still beating the shit out of half of the cast of the first Thanksgiving. When has ignoring a wound been the best policy? When has hiding a zombie bite ever worked out for the greater good? Because let me tell you, that T-virus is still actively coursing through the country's veins. Nailed it, monkey! I f***ing love you. American Indians that have lost roughly 99% of their territory have been removed to areas with a higher risk of being pulverized by extreme weather events brought on by that whole climate change thing. It's the same disingenuous logic of separate but equal facilities created for Black Americans during segregation, the ending of which is only slightly older than Paul Rudd, by the way. Except we're still doing it. We're still sweeping the oldest demographic of Americans under the rug, but now the rug has a bunch of tornadoes in it. According to a study published in the journal Science on the long-term effects of displacement in America, out of 380 Native American tribes the study observed, 220 were forcibly relocated onto land averaging less than 3% of the size of their original territory. That's like going from a 3-bedroom house to a single square of tile in the desert. Also, each tribe was moved an average of around 150 miles away from their homeland, with some tribes, like the Kickapoo, being relocated nearly 1,000 miles away. And America didn't move them to good land. All that land was reserved for white people. No, these tribes got moved to garbage land, where temperatures break 100 degrees Fahrenheit almost half the year in some cases, and the average rainfall is a third lower than the areas the tribes originally inhabited. There's a romantic notion of Native Americans that pop culture presents, of tribes living off the land in wind-blasted desert landscapes because they possess some ancient mythical knowledge of nature. The reality is, they didn't live in those places, because who would? That's where America sent them after throwing them out of their homes, to barely habitable land that literally nobody wanted because it sucks. And what about the other 160 tribes covered by the study, you ask? They're doing well, you hope? You curious little bears, you? Well, they don't have any federally recognized land to quantify. And it's not even like this is an old wrong that we've just continuously neglected to make right, even though that's definitely true. It's an old wrong that America keeps doing. Like trickle-down economics, or letting Mel Gibson make movies. Why are we still doing that? Who is demanding Mel Gibson? Back in 2019, the Supreme Court ruled that roughly half the state of Oklahoma was still Muskogee Creek Indian Territory. Congress had granted the land to the Muskogee Creek Nation as a tribal reservation in an 1866 treaty, and the reservation was never explicitly dissolved when Oklahoma became a state.
But that's good, right? That means the American Indians get their land back?
Are you asking me?
Yes! Wombo is asking you, silly goat! Wombo wants to drink his turkey gravy spider milkshake in celebration of Thanksgiving, but Wombo can't do that if Mr. Cody wants Wombo to feel bad about it.
I mean, yes, you can do that, Warmbo. Again, the point isn't to make you feel guilty about celebrating Thanksgiving. It's to make you understand that if we're going to celebrate it, we need to be honest with ourselves about how America has done nothing but fail its native people for hundreds of— wait, a what milkshake?
Oh, yeah, Wombo has no teeth, so I have to drink all of my Thanksgivings.
Ooh, we should get Warmbo some teeth.
Absolutely not. Don't get Warmbo teeth. Nobody get Warmbo teeth. But to answer your question, yes, it is a good thing that the Muskogee Creek Nation got its reservation territory back. For now. You see, Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt is trying like hell to get the Supreme Court to reverse its decision on the grounds that it creates a huge law enforcement problem for the state. By law, certain crimes committed on reservation territory can only be tried in federal court, and several state convictions have already been overturned because of the Supreme Court's ruling, including the conviction of a non-Indigenous man for the murder of a Native American woman and her 2 children. That is a legitimate and immediate issue that needs to be addressed somehow. Any affected cases must be retried by federal prosecutors, and that process takes time, which could mean the statute of limitations could expire on some cases before they ever make it back to court. Governor Stitt created the Oklahoma Commission on Cooperative Sovereignty to study the issue and make recommendations to Congress about the court's decision. However, 4 of the commission's members are oil and gas company executives, including the commissioner's chair, Larry Nichols. Nichols is the co-founder of Devon Energy, one of the state's biggest fossil fuel companies. And wouldn't you know it, one of the first briefs to be filed when the case first reached the Supreme Court was filed by the Oklahoma Independent Petroleum Association, which argued that the real crime being done here was the threat the ruling posed to their delicious oil and gas leases, and the possibility that they would have to conform to tribal land use regulations instead of the more lenient regulations imposed by all their buddies in Congress. Hey, did I mention that the Oklahoma Commission on Cooperative Sovereignty contains exactly 0 indigenous tribe members? Go ahead and let that sink in. Really, swish around like an oak-aged glass of fine dining piss. Governor Stitt also filed a lawsuit this year against the Department of the Interior, fighting their authority to regulate coal mining in the newly recognized Muskogee Creek Nation's territory. He filed 0 lawsuits about any of those overturned convictions. Kind of seems like he doesn't really care about that. Kind of seems like he's using the pretense of morality to distract from his actual goal of safeguarding the stranglehold of the fossil fuel industry. Hey! We haven't even talked about COVID yet. And like literally every topic we now discuss, there's likely a COVID angle to all of this. In this case, COVID has had a disproportionate effect on Native Americans, thanks in large part to the government's long-abiding preference to ignore them completely whenever possible. According to data jointly collected by the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center, the Johns Hopkins Center for American Indian Health, and Indian Country Today, American Indians and Alaskan Natives are 3.5 times more likely to be hospitalized for the coronavirus. The high hospitalization rate can be attributed to several factors, including poorly funded and insufficient healthcare infrastructure, limited access to healthcare services, and underlying health problems specific to Native Americans, who are more likely to suffer from heart disease and diabetes, which can compound the severity of the virus. All of those factors are directly related to relocation. Abigail Echo Hawk, director of the Urban Indian Health Institute and the chief research officer for the Seattle Indian Health Board, explained in a 2020 interview with the journal Science that the colonialist treatment of indigenous people by the American government cut tribes off from their traditional diets and spiritual practices, which directly contributes to the rates of obesity, heart disease, diabetes, and other health problems in Native Americans being higher than that of white Americans. That was compounded by the inexcusably mismanaged amount of federal aid provided to Native communities in the early days of the pandemic. The initial $2.2 trillion of federal aid provided by the CARES Act allotted only $8 billion for tribal governments, less than 0.1% of the total fund. Of that money, roughly half was set aside to be dispersed to the country's 574 federally recognized tribes according to their respective populations. However, those population numbers were determined by census data rather than citizenship information provided by the tribal governments themselves, and the census has historically never been too concerned with keeping an accurate count of the country's native population. For the first 70 years the census was conducted, it explicitly excluded Indians not taxed, meaning any Native Americans who still lived on tribal lands and under tribal law. The census didn't start counting people who lived on reservations until 1900, and tribal communities remain among the communities with the lowest self-response rates. Navajo Nation, the largest and most populous Native American territory in America, had a self-response rate of 3% in 2020. And can you freaking blame them? If my government had a rich history of kidnapping and killing my children, I certainly wouldn't volunteer any information to them. But because the American government has no idea how many Native Americans actually live here, and doesn't really care to know, this resulted in tribes receiving a portion of federal aid that was dramatically lower than their actual populations. For instance, the Delaware tribe of Indians has over 11,000 enrolled citizens, but because the government doled out money based on the blazingly inaccurate numbers collected by the census, they received only $100,000, roughly $9 per person. Basically, the government bought everyone a ticket to a matinee showing of Red Notice. And why would you even do that? It's also on Netflix. But also, why even see that movie in general, huh? Enough about Red Notice. As Echo Hawk stated in her interview, centuries of displacement and oppression created a perfect environment to kill indigenous people in a pandemic. And you really can't argue with her. I mean, you can. But why would you? 'Cause you'd lose? Who likes losing? Earlier this year, Congress passed new legislation adding an additional $31 billion of relief money to Native populations, including $20 billion for tribal governments, $6 billion for the Indian Health Service and its related Native American health systems, and over $2 billion for housing and primary, secondary, and higher education programs. This legislation passed without a single Republican vote. Because again, the people shouting the loudest about the importance of preserving the myth of Thanksgiving don't actually care about what the holiday represents. Who'da thunk? The American government's general lack of giving a single candied Thanksgiving fart about how many indigenous people live within its borders extends to its treatment of the ongoing problem of missing indigenous women. According to Ty Simpson, a member of the Nez Perce tribe and the director of social change for the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence, nearly 700 indigenous women have disappeared between 2011 and 2021 in the same area that Gabby Petito went missing, and exactly none of those cases received the national attention of Petito's disappearance. It's the same problem faced by every minority community in America. The Black and Missing Foundation notes that when a child of color goes missing, they tend to get labeled as runaways, while adults of color who go missing are dismissed as criminals on the run or otherwise hiding from law enforcement. You know, because the police are racist. And a missing persons case involving a person of color has simply never earned the kind of media frenzy as Gabby Petito, or Natalie Holloway, or Lacey Peterson, or Kaylee Anthony, or Susan Smith's children, or John Benet Ramsey. The fact is, the media doesn't latch on to missing persons cases unless they're white. You know, because the media is also racist. And with indigenous women, the problem is exacerbated by the fact that law enforcement often doesn't even know that the women have disappeared. For instance, according to the Idaho State Police, there are currently 9 missing persons cases involving indigenous people as of this past September. Simpson says that data collected by grassroots organizations puts that number somewhere between 40 and 50. That's a pretty big discrepancy. Meanwhile, according to the National Crime Information Center, 5,712 cases of missing American, Indian, and Alaskan Native women and girls were reported in 2016. But NamUs, the Department of Justice's federal missing persons database, only recorded 116 of those cases. That's an even bigger discrepancy. There's very few situations where you can be off by 5,596, and that is an okay thing. I guess if you're like the foreman of a rice factory doing like a rice inventory, it's hard to be whimsical about thousands of missing people. And sure, Simpson says part of that discrepancy can be attributed to the lack of communication and cooperation between reservation police and state and federal law enforcement agencies. But it's hard not to factor in the age-old tale of cops simply not giving a shit. Oh, they're not missing, they just took off somewhere. Wait for a bit and they'll show back up. Or, well, your daughter's a sex worker or a drug addict. They probably just OD'd somewhere. They're not worth valuable cop time that could be spent staging embarrassing videos about how people need to stop being mean to us. And so a report never gets filed or isn't followed up on. And after a while, these missing women just slip through the cracks. It's awful. And it's a direct result of the systemic apathy that we encourage every time we erase Native American history from our schools and holidays. But I'm not saying that Thanksgiving has to become some parade of Native pain, trauma, and suffering. That doesn't help anyone, and it can inflict even more pain. What I'm saying is that these problems need to be considered every day and, fixed. Not just one special day. They need visibility as the first step to a solution. For example, as we were writing this episode, Biden signed an executive order directing officials to work with Native tribes and develop a strategy for resolving all of these missing persons cases. Will it amount to anything? I don't know. I'm not a magical racist shaman character shoehorned into a film, but it's certainly the right direction for us to take. But it's also only part of the solution. So what can we all do as Americans to start really correcting this?
Are you asking me?
Oh good, this bit again.
Cody, hey, Cody. Look, I'm not hearing the sound of metal against teeth, and I feel like I should be hearing that by now.
So what can we all do as Americans, not weird quasi-interdimensional Feltian freaks, to correct all of this? I'm glad you asked, hypothetical wizard viewer using me as a conduit to speak your question. It seems like a good place to start would be to actually give thanks by teaching kids to recognize any of the innumerable contributions Indigenous people have made to modern American culture. For instance, most of the stuff we cram down our feed pipes on Thanksgiving were first grown by Native Americans. I'm talking corn, talking about pumpkins, talking about beans, talking peanuts and tomatoes, talking peppers, a squash, and motherfucking potatoes! Try to imagine your life without potatoes. You can't, because it would be terrible. A potatoless hellscape, where we stare longingly at the void nuzzled against our lonely burgers. Thanksgiving would be a grim collection of European meat bricks that we gloomily march toward every year if it weren't for Native Americans. The KFC famous bowl and 90% of Cracker Barrel's menu would simply not exist without the contributions of America's oldest living culture. Not only that, but Native American agriculture, primarily corn and potatoes, constitute 60% of the world's food supply. And let's not forget about tobacco, for better or worse. There are a few people out there who are probably thankful for that contribution, wouldn't you say? Philip Morris, for example, Joe Camel, and the Marlboro Man. And European settlers would have been profoundly boned had Indigenous Americans not shared their farming techniques, which in at least one tribe included developed irrigation systems. Even the American system of government was based in part on the government of the Iroquoian League. Quintessentially American things like log cabins and barbecue and even football began in some form in Native American culture. Modern football was essentially created by the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, a college football team largely composed of Native American players. The team was the first in history to run trick plays that depended on hiding the ball, because the players were smaller on average than most other teams. They also invented staples of the game like the forward pass and the spiral throw, which you may recognize as the weapon Aaron Rodgers wields in his war against against science. The point is, Native American culture is American culture. It's the root of so many American traditions, including Thanksgiving. Acknowledging that in classrooms across the country seems like it would be a good way to start truly being thankful. You know, considering that it's just the facts, which I've heard don't care about your feelings. Okay, I know we just talked about this in an episode, but seriously, holy dear balls, I don't think we can fully appreciate enough how this Daily Wire video is just straight up propaganda, considering everything I've just said. What kind of fucking brain do you need to feel the need to justify our horrible genocide-filled history with Native Americans? Why make this weird lie and then try to pass it off as satire? Why not just be respectful and thoughtful about this subject and perhaps recognize that our culture and indigenous culture are fundamentally intertwined, even to this day? Like, hey, remember Dune, that kick-ass book movie about sand and worms and how happy everyone is to see Jason Momoa? Dune's father, Frank Herbert, based a great deal of the story's ecological themes of unchecked capitalism driving a planet to the brink of extinction and the importance of conservation efforts being developed in harmony with nature on his experiences with the Quileute and Hoh peoples of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. Herbert grew up in Washington and befriended a Quileute man named Henry Martin, a friendship Herbert wrote about in his novel Soul Catcher. The seeds that were planted in Herbert's mind and eventually grew into Timothée Chalamet's glorious head of hair billowing in the wind on the desert planet Arrakis came from Herbert watching Washington's indigenous people constantly fighting the environmentally destructive encroachment of the logging industry. The Quileute people were also once whalers, and the sandworms of Dune are a clear analog to the whales the Quileute people used to hunt. They gave you Dune, you jerks! Any f***ing way. Acknowledging the contributions of America's native people and making the real story of their culture and history a part of Thanksgiving is a good start, but there's much more to be done to make amends for the centuries of erasure and marginalization. Back in the 1980s, the federal government granted permission for tribes to run casinos to provide jobs and generate revenue for their communities. But despite a few success stories, it's done almost nothing to reduce the extremely high rate of poverty, unemployment, and disease experienced by Native Americans. Casinos simply aren't enough. So what else can be done? A common sticking point for bad faith politicians and media talking heads is that there's simply no way to make up for hundreds of years of genocide, so why bother doing anything at all? Which is a convenient argument for people who don't want to do anything at all. Also, the country's indigenous peoples are literally telling the government what they want, and what they want is their fucking land back. I will say it again. I'll put it up full screen. Monkey, they want. The argument is pretty simple. Give indigenous land back to indigenous people. It's a part of their identity, woven into ceremonies and traditions that date back much further than the ink on the lease that the oil and gas companies signed. Indigenous people also deserve to be able to have decent land to build homes and schools, and not the consolation prize arid dirt patches to which the federal government violently relocated them. Places that have access to clean water, where communities can be visible, instead of ignored to the point of such invisibility that literally thousands of missing persons cases are never even recognized by the Department of Justice. Currently, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, whom you may remember as the actual tribe who met with European settlers on the first Thanksgiving, are fighting to get 300 acres of ancestral land in Massachusetts restored to them. Their claim was initially approved, but the decision was struck down by the Department of the Interior based on some pilgrim technicality, and now they're stuck in appeals. Meanwhile, the Lakota people have been pushing for the government to return the Black Hills, the land upon which several honkies' faces were carved into Mount Rushmore. That land was granted to the Lakota in an 1868 treaty, only to be immediately taken back less than 10 years later once white people found gold in them there hills. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Lakota people back in 1980, acknowledging that the government had violated the treaty and that the Lakota were owed monetary compensation to the tune of a sum that is now over $1 billion. But the Lakota have never collected 1 cent because they don't want the money. They want their fucking land back. pretty tough to keep shrugging your shoulders about what's to be done to make amends when the people to whom you must make those amends are explicitly telling you what they want in no uncertain terms. Do you want us to literally spell it out? Because we will. Look, the title monkey isn't a great speller, but his heart is in the right place. And you'll be happy to know that some progress is being made. The Wiyot people in California recently had 200 acres of land returned to them on Duluwat Island by the city council with no strings attached. The city just gave it back because it was the right thing to do. And the United Methodist Church in Oklahoma unconditionally returned a plot of land to the Wyandot Nation. The church's former General Secretary of Global Ministries, Thomas Kemper, explained that the church wanted to contribute to the healing of past wrongs with a concrete act of giving, instead of just voicing words of support. You know, giving, like what this holiday is about. And despite what Oklahoma Governor Oil Boner is trying to argue, returning indigenous land to America's indigenous people isn't an impossible or unreasonable request. Queensland recently returned 4 national parks, nearly 400,000 acres of land, including the world's oldest rainforest, to Australia's indigenous Eastern Kuku-Yalanji people. And earlier this year, President Beau Biden restored federal protection to the Bear Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante monuments in Utah, lands considered sacred to the state's indigenous people that contain priceless pieces of culture and history like petroglyphs and cave dwellings. President this f***ing guy had previously reduced Grand Staircase by half and Bear Ears by nearly 90% to make way for fossil fuel mining, because every single opponent to the restoration of indigenous land is really just the same dude. This dude.
I drink your milkshake.
The fact is, most of America's national parks aren't natural wonders at all. They were carefully cultivated by indigenous people over the course of centuries, much in the same way native Californians meticulously but unobtrusively shaped the land to cycle crops and game and protect it from rampant wildfires. So why not just make like Queensland and return them? Placing our national parks under the care and supervision of the indigenous people they were stolen from seems like it would be a significant way to contribute to the healing of past wrongs. The kind of concrete action America needs to take to prove that it can be more than just a stooge guarding the interests of oil barons and racists. The purpose of updating our national story of Thanksgiving isn't to make kids feel bad about being white, although it's worth pointing out that white kids only make up around half of public school children. So even that argument is still promoting white normativity. It's arguing for white supremacy with white supremacy. Magnificent. Anyway, the goal isn't some liberal plot to make kids feel bad or to make people feel ashamed. The goal is to make people feel outraged and knowledgeable, outraged at the injustice, both past and present, so that this treatment doesn't continue for another 250 years for the sake of smiling classroom decorations celebrating a holiday where we all get bloated and drunk and watch football, a sport invented by American Indians. This entire society of people who have lived on this continent, in this country, since time immemorial, is being reduced to a sidekick role in a school play, played by Johnny Depp, told through the lens of white America, which is only about 10 generations old. How is it that the only history we learn about this country is the history that began a few hundred years ago? We should be outraged about that. But even then, outrage isn't the only goal. If we truly want to embrace the traditions and morals that Thanksgiving is supposed to represent, giving thanks, spreading goodwill, loving each other as one people, we have to acknowledge the wrongs that were done and try to make amends. That's what the holiday should be all about. Charity. Right, Warmbo?
My spiders escaped.
No, they didn't.
What is at my door?
Dig in, man. You can garnish the batteries with them.
Ooh, I'm hanging up.
Come on.
I hate it here. I should go on strike. I'm gonna go on strike. Cliffhanger! Bah, bah, bah. Hey there, that was a longie. They're all longies these days. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe and do all those sort of YouTube-y things. We've got some more news patreon.com/some more news. And we've got a podcast that is this podcast, where all the podcasts are, including another podcast called Even More News that you also might like. And merch with the Warmbo guy on it. One of them, not all of them, only the one that you've seen so far. Ooh, lore. And guess what? Happy f***ing Thanksgiving to you.